Welcome to the Therapy Show podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard. In each episode, I interview a seasoned and knowledgeable talk therapist from the counseling world to glean valuable insights, techniques, and tools that you can apply to your practice and your life. And if you're considering a career in the counseling field or just want to hear about what it's like to be a talk therapist, then this is the podcast for you. Today, I'm diving into a deeply intriguing and potentially transformative topic, plant medicine and its role in navigating the complex terrain of grief. And I'm thrilled to welcome back a very special guest, Pedro, for his third appearance on the show. He has become a listener favorite, known for his insightful discussions on addiction healing and now the profound connection between plant medicine and grief. So in our conversation, we're going to explore how plant medicine can offer a unique pathway for those seeking to understand the process of their grief, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the mourning of a part of oneself. Plant medicine has shown to provide profound insights and emotional release for many people. Pedro will share his expertise and personal experiences, shedding light on how these ancient practices can support individuals in their healing journey. We'll discuss the importance of approaching plant medicine with respect, intention, and an open heart, as well as the transformative potential it holds for dealing with grief. So, whether you're familiar with plant medicine or simply curious about alternative healing modalities, this episode promises to offer valuable perspectives and possibly even a new understanding of grief and recovery. So, stay tuned as we embark on this enlightening conversation with Pedro. But before we hear from Pedro, I hope you'll unlock the transformative power of your mind with my free guided meditation and hypnosis recordings. Dive into a world where a focused attention and deep relaxation open the doors to incredible shifts in your mental state and physical well-being. Experience the magic of your consciousness as it guides you towards profound changes, rejuvenating your entire being from the inside out. All you need to do is click the link in the show notes to get started. Well, hey, friends, welcome back to another episode of The Therapy Show. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard. And once again, I have Pedro on the podcast, his third appearance, and I'm super excited to have him back on the show this week. How are you, Pedro?
I'm great, Lisa. Thanks for having me on yet again. I feel
Sure.
quite honored.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, your episodes are very, very well received. I get a lot of comments. I got a lot of downloads, which of course I find it really interesting. I kind of look and see where what the downloads are, how quickly the downloads go up, and I know that that's a great topic and people are interested in hearing more. So I am really happy to have you back. And today I know we want to touch on we were going to talk about it in the last episode, but we went kind of long on addiction. So if you haven't listened to that episode on plant medicine and addiction, the link is in the show notes. But today we're going to focus on plant medicine and grief. But before we dive into that, I do have a question for you. And I know we touched on it in previous episodes, but I want to ask you again, because prior to recording, you said you had some thoughts on this. So I'm going to ask you the question again. How does someone know if it's time to try plant medicine?
Yeah, thanks. So we've kicked this question around a little bit in the previous two episodes, and I just felt like it was unsatisfactory. There's not a perfect specific answer that I can give, but after talking about it with some people in my community and listening to the podcast again, the best way that I can explain it is people feel, especially people who are called to do deeper work, like there's curiosity. People feel like this might help me and they might come for ceremony. But often the people who are working with the plants for a couple of times or many times, they're drawn to it because they feel like there's something inside of them that needs to come out.
Mm.
And they don't know how to open up and let it go. And
Okay.
that something can either be something seemingly positive, like some sort of blocked creativity or expression of themselves. But more often it's blocked negativity. It's a kind of repression or some childhood trauma, or maybe something they don't even have a recollection of, but things that happened in utero even. And there's no amount of CBT work that's going to that's going to get to those kinds of things.
Sure.
So that's ultimately the kind of drive that brings people to deep work with the plants.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so I like how you kind of described it as feeling blocked. And I can think of times in my life where I have felt blocked. And can you give us some examples of, what people say to you when they come to you about feeling blocked?
There are there are people who, for example, there's a person who was adopted, and so his parents gave him up at a very young age, and he has no recollection of that. And he knows that there's some trauma around that. And he's done a lot of work and he can't get any deeper into it. And he doesn't have any images through dreams or other things to kind of get at those deeply held emotions or feelings. And so that person's come to work with plants as a result because he knows it's there.
Okay.
Intellectually, all of psychologically, we know that there's going to be some real pain in a being in a young person as a result of that type of abandonment, and he's not been able to make a dent in it. So there's this blockage, and plant medicine is the answer for him, he thinks, at this point, to kind of release that, to explore that, and how
Mhm.
it's affected his life.
Okay. So this is somebody that you've worked with. Has this person done the ceremony or
It's
ceremonies?
just the person I've talked to.
Okay.
I
Okay.
have
Because I
not, this person hasn't walked down the path fully yet, but is
okay.
is sort of sniffing around.
Okay. I was just curious. I know I've told you this, that I'm working on my certification in hypnotherapy, and that just kind of reminds me of something that maybe somebody would come to hypnotherapy for as well. So I'm just kind of fascinated, like, oh, what did you guys find out? Because I have a theory on what might be going on and what might be discovered. But anyway, that's a whole other side. So I think that's really fascinating. Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of like this feeling of there's something in the way, you can't put your finger on it. If you could just get to the root of it, things would shift and you might have some enlightenment and can then kind of process through and move forward. I think that's really interesting. And a lot of people come to therapy feeling that way, but you're right, like, how much CBT therapy can you do for that blocked feeling? It's You have to have some type of experience that helps you move through the blockage, if that's how I would describe it. Is that how you would describe it?
I think of things in terms of images
Hmm.
often, and that's why I mentioned dreams, because images are stores or holders of energy. And so if we have an image,
Hmm.
and psychedelics often, or plant medicine often produce images, visions, and those
Hmm.
visions have behind them all kinds of energy, emotion, feeling, then that's how things shift.
Okay.
It
Gotcha.
doesn't always have to be images, but more often than not, it comes in the form of images.
Yeah. Okay. So another aside here with hypnotherapy, the certification I'm working on, has you when you're working with somebody, you have them go back to scenes of
Mhm.
in their of what happened. So that's interesting that, it's revisiting an image or a dream or a scene of some sort, kind of getting into that space of being able to do it. Pretty cool, I think. Okay. All right. So let's shift a little bit. Well, is there anything else you want to say about how does someone know if it's time to try plant medicine?
No, I think that's good. We can, from there, this will transition nicely into our topic of grief for today.
Okay, yeah. So we wanted to talk about grief in our last episode, but we went kind of long. So, what do we need to know about grief and plant medicine? Where do you want to start with that?
Yeah, when you asked me to talk about grief, I had to reflect on it, and it was enlightening to me to think that actually a lot of the work, the majority of the work that gets done in plant medicine work is grief work. But I would expand what we understand as grief beyond the realm of just grieving lost loved ones, or people and opportunities in our lives. And so often grief work and medicine work, or grieving in medicine work, is about going back to moments in our lives when we lost some sort of vital energy, when we kind of cut off some sort of natural spark in ourselves. And so and we can talk about that in a number of ways. But so I'd like to talk about both of those things, having worked with people who have grieved loved ones being lost, and then also those moments where the medicine takes us back to look at times in our lives where we've sort of abandoned ourselves, or not just abandoned, but really killed a part of ourselves, or a natural expression of ourselves.
Okay. So before we talk about that, is that something that people come to you with and they say, I feel like I've killed a part of myself, or is that something that's kind of discovered through the ceremony?
The latter.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. That's what I thought.
the latter. And
Okay.
let let me tell a story here to set the scene and to give us an image really to better understand what I'm talking about. So a couple weekends ago, actually the coldest night of the year here, it was like 18 degrees. I was driving home through the country, and I'd been down on my land winterizing pipes, which is always a fun job, helping a friend set a toilet. And so it was late. It was like 11 o'clock. I'm driving through the woods, and there's this huge fire off the side of the road, and it happens to be a car. A car had flipped. Of course, it was a person that you I guess your husband knew, right?
Um,
Tom Hall, is that his name?
well, my husband didn't know him, but a good friend of
A friend.
his was really close, good friend of his.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, the truck had flipped, and there was gasoline in it, or gas in it, and it caused huge explosion, and the flames were 15, 20 feet high. And I was one of the first people on the scene. And the other two cars there, we sort of looked at each other. There was nothing we could do, and it was cold outside again. One guy had someone had already called the cops or the ambulance and the fire department, and we we had we couldn't stay. No one really felt comfortable leaving, but also we all seemed to have better things to move on to. Whether it was too cold, one guy had to drive up to New York, and so we said, well, everybody drive safely, and we'll let the authorities take it over from here. And so we all went our separate ways. Um, I got home, fell right to sleep. Next day was working. I hadn't thought about it at all until another day later when I told the story, and a friend of mine said, that's so disrespectful to have seen what was probably the death of a person and not at least stop and witness it, really witness it and pray. And she's absolutely right. Um, and I think that so often in our lives, we have these moments where there's sort of small deaths that we experience, where we cut ourselves off from some vital expression of ourselves, whether because we've learned through society that it's not accepted, or through our upbringing, through our parental guidance that we shouldn't act like that. And we keep driving, so to speak. We just drive right by and say, that's not our death. It's not our death to mourn. It's not our loss to grieve. And it's always easier to hit the accelerator rather than the brake. So when I talk about grief work as recognizing moments when we've lost that vital energy in ourselves, that's kind of what I'm talking about. The medicine will bring us back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years and say, look at this, look at what you did to yourself in that moment, and how it's changed you. And likewise, it might be you did something to someone else, and that really hurt them, stunted them in a way. And it says you need to get down on your knees and witness it and mourn it, and ultimately be grateful that for life that you have. So do people come back thinking about those moments? No, they come up often as complete shocks and surprises, that there are these seemingly small moments where they suddenly realized, wow, that was not so small. And I had forgotten completely about that. And they often come up as part of a bigger process around a certain complex or theme. So that's how I want to sort of set the stage for talking about grief as recognizing these moments that we all too quickly drive past because life is busy, and we don't appreciate it like we should often, in ourselves and outside of ourselves. So with that said, uh, what would you like to start with? You want to talk about the grieving for lost loved ones, or that idea of grieving for things where you've cut yourself off from energy?
Yeah, let's just keep going with the grieving for things that we've cut off or
Okay.
abandoned. Let's just keep going with that as I think. And if we have time, we'll talk about grieving the loss of a loved one. Maybe that's a whole other episode. We'll see where we get, how far we
Okay.
get. Okay.
I start with an example about myself,
Mhm.
because I can go into more specificity there.
Okay.
It starts with a dream. I had this great dream in which I was following this path behind my father, following in his footsteps, so to speak. And we came upon this forest, and it was completely clear cut as far as the eye could see.
Mhm.
Imagine these huge trees, bigger, 30 feet across, like bigger than sequoias, bigger than redwoods, and everything is mowed down. And in the dream, I thought to myself, well, this happened about 30 years ago. And anytime something like that happens in a dream, you have to ask yourself, what happened to myself 30 years ago? And I would have been about 5 or 6. As far as my family remembers, there's nothing traumatic in my life around that time. And but it is that age where a person becomes conscious and conscious of gender, and it might speak to the way in which I started to identify as a boy, and there are certain expectations on a boy, and follow in my father's sort of very masculine tendencies. And through that image, and then through using plant medicine, I was able to feel into all the ways that that happened. And so, understanding where I had a certain desire to play a musical instrument at a young age, but that wasn't something that a boy did in my house. And so I sort of decided not to do band after all, and appreciating that how that stunted me, And every time something like that happened, that's another tree that's chopped down. This magnificent expression of true nature, of my nature that was eliminated because I had learned um, through my nurture that that wasn't appropriate. And there was a lot of grieving. There'd be times just to, without plant medicine, just to come lay down uh, in meditation and just to call up that image, kind of like we are talking about at the very outset, brought forth all kinds of tears and upset and anger. And I spent a long time, months with that dream. And I still think about it as a kind of defining vision of appreciating who I could have become, mourning that, and appreciating what I am now.
Interesting. It's really interesting. Okay.
And so, in a more medicine, specifically more medicine related story, this happens a lot with people who, let's say, women who've been sexually abused, or men for that matter. So often they get taken back to that moment where the moment of the violation,
Mhm.
and they're brought back there because they've divorced themselves or they've cut themselves off, not consciously, of course, from that moment because of the great suffering that's involved in that. And the medicine brings them back to that moment to feel what was happening in them. And the more, always the sort of startling to the people, startling to the victims, is that they didn't actually have that much suffering or anger in the moment or about the person, the perpetrator. They are always shocked in how much self-reproach there was afterwards. And the person who was really cutting them off from their own expression was themselves,
Mm.
especially in cases where it was a childhood abuse,
Mm.
and the type of self-blame that happens after that event, as innocent as a child is, can't and trusting of the people around them, has to imagine that they themselves are the bad one.
Right.
And so the medicine in that case allows them to grieve, their own self, well, the grieve for what was lost and all the suffering that they inflicted upon themselves.
Interesting. Is that, I mean, being the healer in this, is that like a hunch that you have going into it and so it's not so surprising anymore that that's what what comes from it, I guess.
Do you mean a hunch about what?
Like just knowing that sometimes it's going to be self-reproach. You said like the person going through the ceremony, you have like a hunch that this might come from it. It's more of a something they feel about themselves more so than it is about, the event itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's complex. So if we're talking about sexual violence, like there's the impact,
Mm-hmm.
there's the trauma, which is just the moment of impact.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, of course, monstrous.
Sure.
And the type of feelings and the self-hatred and the self-reproach of the violator is
Mm-hmm.
also part of the equation. That gets inserted into the person as well. And
Mm-hmm.
it creates an immense amount of confusion. But then in connection with that is also the sort of self-reproach that the person is experiences thereafter.
Mm.
And so in my experience, that's been categorically mm, almost always the case. Almost always the case, especially in the case of children,
Yeah.
people who've been abused as a child. As
Right.
an adult, it can be different because they have the consciousness to understand that this is not their fault at all.
Hmm. Hmm.
Different case.
Right.
So in this case, I'm just talking about really people who've been abused in childhood. And this is not a hunch of mine, but it's them expressing their experiences afterwards about how impressed they were with the fact that this is my um, so much of this was my decision to blame myself and stay in that self-blame in a completely unconscious way. I think another interesting and really impactful event is, and this somewhat bridges between grieving sort of lost vital energy, but also grieving the loss of loved ones, is abortion.
Mm.
There have been a number of women, I can think of at least two, who've had in a plant medicine ceremony, have had their aborted fetuses, have had those spirits come back to them and talk to them about the situation and given those women so much release and understanding and free them from guilt or
Mm.
free them from whatever heaviness they were carrying about that decision. On the other side, I've worked with men who have been part of a decision to, abort a fetus. And one in particular, there's a whole life that's cut off when you decide not to have a child. And both of these men were men who are not biological fathers now. And so fatherhood has not become part of their life. And they were taken back by the medicine. And one in specific was taken back in the medicine to realize that he didn't have the proper respect or honor for the gravity of the situation, especially on the woman's behalf. And so he had to kind of grieve his own lack of respect and care for just how momentous of a moment it was in his life. And that also brought up all kinds of feelings. He wanted to reach out to this woman, even though he hadn't contacted her in years, and apologize and talk about the things that he'd been experiencing around this event. But ultimately, thankfully, he decided to contain that experience. A lot of the discomfort he was feeling was all needed to be directed inward rather than he needed to forgive himself. He
Gotcha.
didn't need to go seeking the forgiveness of another. And that's what he found after sitting with it for about a week. And he was grateful he didn't reach out to her because her life has changed and who knows if she even needs him to talk to her anymore.
Sure.
It was more about his own ego.
Now, was that something that he was that blocked within him, or did he come to you specifically to work on that?
That was a surprise for him. It wasn't a thing that he thought about
Okay.
with any seriousness in a while.
Hmm.
So yeah, it came up. He had done a series of ceremonies, and it came up in one of those ceremonies as a piece. Maybe it was 30 minutes of his experience, recollecting that, feeling into different memories and thinking about his life, kind of really reckoning what his life could have been and
Hmm.
how he could have acted differently, and accepting that, ultimately accepting the decisions he made and being grateful for the life that he has now, which is so much of the process, is accept the situations and the decisions that you've made, love them, embrace them, and be grateful for where you are and who you are. So that's the kind of arc of medicine work, is uncomfortable things rise up or beautiful things. It's not always pain and suffering, not by a long shot. But when those things do come up, you open to them, you have to feel them, accept them, learn from them, and ultimately be grateful for who you are and what you are as a result of those experiences. And sometimes forgiveness, practice a lot of forgiveness. How does this, I'm interested how this kind of jives with your understanding of grief work and your experience working with people who are grieving, or who maybe not grieving, but conventionally grieving, but
Right.
reckoning with these same sorts of issues.
I want to share with you a fabulous offer from Therapy Notes. Have you ever felt swamped by endless paperwork and tangled schedules? Then step into a world of clarity with Therapy Notes. Hailed as the gold standard in electronic health records, Therapy Notes is your beacon in the dynamic realm of mental health care. With their round the clock 7-day live phone support, it's evident why they shine with a dazzling 4.9 out of 5 stars on trustpilot.com and Google. From effortless billing to streamlined scheduling, precise note taking, and state of the art telehealth, Therapy Notes is your all in one solution. And for the prescribers out there, they're ecstatic to introduce e-prescribe. And if you're switching lanes from another EHR, they've got your back. They will seamlessly migrate your demographic data at zero cost, ensuring you hit the ground running. So become part of the 100,000 plus mental health professionals community who've chosen Therapy Notes. And to embark on a 2-month complimentary journey, just tap the link in the show notes or use promo code Lisa at checkout at therapynotes.com. That's promo code Lisa, Lisa, at checkout at therapynotes.com. So dive into the Therapy Notes experience today and see why it's the talk of the town. Navigate with confidence and choose the best. Yeah, it's similar yet different, Sometimes people present for therapy thinking they want to talk about one thing, but it turns out that it's another. So it's not surprising to me at all. It's just we go about it, the process a little bit differently, right? But I think ultimately we have the same goal in mind is to find out what does this person really need and what are they really struggling with and just kind of meet them where they're at and let's see where this goes. Having no agenda, right? Like I don't have an agenda when somebody comes to therapy. I mean, my agenda is to help them as best I can,
Hmm.
but it sounds like it's a similar thing for you. You're here, you provide this option for healing, knowing that it could go in a lot of different directions and you're here for it. You're here for that person. You're here to support them. So that's how I hear it, That's how
Hmm.
I'm taking it in.
And that's how the often how the plant will show up for a person, honestly. If this makes, I'll see how well I can articulate this, but certainly, so let's a ceremony would be, let's say, 6 or 7 hours. And oftentimes there's a real arc, or there's a kind of, just call it an arc to that experience if they're open and continuing to accept and be with everything that comes up throughout that time. And so let's say a person comes in very, very scared. They know there's something in their past and it scares them to confront it. And so sometimes or oftentimes I notice that at the beginning of their experience, the first couple hours, things are so beautiful. Sometimes they have the most sort of glistening and pristine understanding of themselves and connection to the world. They feel as good as they've ever felt in their lives. Now, secretly, I think, oh, uh-oh, here it comes. Because the plan is building trust with them and helping them open up and really start to lay down some of their barriers and defenses. And then the plant will take them into a very uncomfortable place that's ultimately for their healing, that they've been sensing that they want to work on. It's not as if the plant's just going to throw you into the lion's pit right off the bat. It's going to do the work and help you see things. And I really like the idea of Carl Jung's complexes. Like it'll walk you around various moments to get you to eventually where you need to go, but it'll do it in some beautifully logical way that defies my logic.
Yeah, and the more I think about it, it's like what allows that to happen, what allows that process to unfold is I think the connection that they have with the person helping them and supporting them and the feelings of safety, the feelings of unconditional positive regard, And I'm just thinking of like when I took communication for counselors, like the first class in grad school, this is all the stuff that you learn about and you have to demonstrate, how to do, but it's hard to demonstrate when you're just role playing it with another student, but it's one of those skills that I think is innate to healers, but at the same time is so important. Like, so just having those and being able to sit with the person and listen and support and trust the process and not, you know, get ahead of yourself as a therapist or the healer is really important. So I was just kind of thinking of like parallel of what you do and what I do. So we just have a different way of getting there, you know.
Yeah.
We have a different technique, or a different, but yet at the same time we're doing similar things. How do you explain this? I don't know. I'm just trying to like parallel
Oh,
relate it.
well, no, you're right. I'll draw another parallel. I work with a Jungian analyst. I'm in analysis, and so we do dream analysis. And
Mm,
he and I talk a lot about how Jungian analysis and plant medicine work are very similar, or dream work and plant work are very similar in that, except that plant work is often front loaded with images and emotions and feelings, and then you kind of integrate it over a long period of time. Dream work is meted out where, okay, you have a dream, you talk about it with your analyst, you deal with some of the emotions and things that came up. Then the next week or 2 weeks later, you have another dream and you talk about that. But ultimately, the processes have the same endpoint, or they'll take the same amount of time to work through this emotional psychological process. It's just how the energy gets,
mm,
when and how it gets released. It's either right off the bat in a big explosion in a ceremony, or it might be measured out through dreams.
mm.
And then you have more conventional counseling or therapy like you do, and that's not so unconscious based, but of course, that's a key component of it.
Yeah, and I
Everything's coming from the unconscious, that is to say. Go
yeah, and
ahead.
I think that's partly why I'm so interested in hypnotherapy is because with hypnotherapy you get to the subconscious thoughts and feelings and experiences really fast through hypnosis, and then like having people like go to scenes, and that to me is just fascinating. Like I don't know, it took me so long to come around to it, but I was talking with somebody, and she said like what she was doing and talk because she wanted me to practice on her. She was like, I want to be, practice hypnotherapy on me. And I was like, okay, let's go do it. And the things that came up in hypnotherapy, she said, it's taken me months to get to this in talk therapy, but here we are. And I went straight to it. And I was like, well, it could be because you already had an idea of what you needed to work on. Like if you hadn't done talk therapy and you had done this first, would it have taken how many sessions would it have taken? So it's something to think about, though. It's fascinating when you can tap into that subconscious and bring up the scenes and then the feelings and the thoughts and the beliefs that you make from those scenes and how you make meaning on them, and they present in your today, in your life today. It's like this big aha moment of,
Mhm.
oh, I can change that belief. I don't have to
Mhm.
subscribe to that anymore. And it sounds like the plants can do the similar things for people too. It's like it brings up the stuff, you're able to get it out unblocked, and here it is in front of you, and you can make the decision. Well, do you want to keep this meaning making subconscious belief on yourself, or do you choose something different moving forward? And yeah, now I feel like I'm just kind of rambling, but it's fascinating,
Well,
how there's so many different ways to help people
yeah, and
really.
exciting and
Yeah,
empowering, really, these
right.
ways of working. It's exciting to get people. I think last time we talked about ego defenses, and what we're discussing here at the heart of it is these images, these techniques blast through the ego defenses and call up things that we've been holding off feeling,
Yeah,
that we've been driving past, that that roadside accident we've been driving past
right.
rather than slowing down and getting on our hands and knees and really witnessing it. So it's necessary, so
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah. Very, very much so. Well, do we have time to touch on grieving
Yeah.
a loss of a
I
loved one? Okay.
I
Let's
have
let's
yeah,
let's go
a
there.
few short stories we can talk about. I'll start with another one about myself. So in that first episode, I shared my story, how it was one of the events that pushed me into medicine work was the loss of my girlfriend who died of a lung embolism when I was 23. And that wasn't necessarily the first thing on my mind. Of course, I thought that I was there to get high. That was the first thing on my mind. But if that came up, and what was interesting is there wasn't so much to release or to grieve about her. I
Mm,
had done some of that work, but what the medicine showed me wasn't so much about grieving her, but it was about releasing my attachments to the idea of her.
mm,
And it was showing me how I had these needs for sexual or physical validation from her or from women, and that she was protecting me, or women had been protecting me from dealing with that, coming to terms with that in myself and releasing that insecurity, and also insecurity about being alone. And that was so powerful that I walked away from those experiences with ayahuasca when I was 23, And I said, that's it. I'm going to be celibate for a year. I don't need to be in a relationship. Like there are things that I need to work on and come to accept myself ultimately as myself so that I can be better, more stable in a relationship. So that's how one way that grief can come up in a ceremony. It might not necessarily be grieving for the loss of a loved one, but helping you release attachments around them, reasons that you're holding on to them, not about the person themselves, but about yourself. But with that said, I'll talk about a couple of events where people had their loved ones reappear in ceremonies. So I was working with a guy who, in relationship to our last conversation about addiction, he had a pretty nasty history of addiction. He had both had a meth and sex addiction that almost tore apart his life, but he'd recovered and was had a good stable life for many years. And his father died when he was a young man, in high school, in fact. And what came up in ceremony was this memory of taking something, one of the last things that had been given to him from his father. He took this thing and he'd sold it. And with the money that he had gained, he'd used that money to buy drugs. The shame that was encoded in that memory and
Mm.
that experience that came up in ceremony, he asked me to hit him. I mean, he was so affected that he needed to feel violence done to him. That's how bad he felt about it. And when he had asked for that, and we were talking to each other, we both felt this strange feeling come to us, and he knew that his father had come back, and his father was here to talk to him.
Mm.
So I left. I walked far away, and I gave those two a long time, and ultimately it was deeply healing for him
Yeah.
to apologize, to talk to his father, this man he felt abandoned by, and yeah, and to apologize. The other story, a woman, she hadn't come for her grandmother reappeared to her in ceremony, and she did not come to mourn the loss of her grandmother, but she came for a number of reasons. She had she also was a victim, had a terrible history of sexual abuse from a very young age. She had all kinds of issues with her pelvis, constipation. I mean, it was a mess. She couldn't sit cross-legged because of the types of physical and energetic binds that were in there from the abuse that she'd taken over her young life. Her grandmother was really the only relative she had who loved her, and her grandmother came back in the middle of ceremony, and she was so delighted. She was so delighted. First of all, she grew up in an unusual Southern Baptist church, I guess unusual even by Southern Baptist standards.
Mhm.
And they emphasized that there were no spirits, that once somebody died, that's it. They were gone. They're in heaven. You couldn't talk to them. Don't even try. And so to have her grandmother appear to her was so heart-giving. She felt so full of grace. Here's this person who loved and accepted her back in her life, and she could talk to her all the time. It just tickled her so much. And in fact, what was so remarkable is around that time, she just moved her legs and suddenly she was sitting cross-legged. And she hadn't sit cross-legged in decades.
Wow. Wow.
There's this huge release. Physically, her body changed.
Mm.
Emotionally, she was different. There's such a release in that moment. That ceremony that's probably the most beautiful and amazing ceremony I've ever seen, um, for a number of reasons. And the addendum to that is she actually didn't have much longer to live. A month later, she died. And it's the way I understand that situation is her grandmother appearing like that made her passing so much easier for her. It gave her this understanding that she's coming, that, she doesn't disappear when she dies, and she's got someone there waiting with her. And that when this woman eventually did die, that I think it made her going so much more sweet than it would have been if she hadn't done ceremony and had received these gifts from her grandma.
That's so fascinating, interesting, and I'm so happy for her.
It was
Mm.
such a beautiful. We had done it out on my land, and it was in
Mm.
And there were lightning bugs everywhere. And I
Mm.
mean, I couldn't, I get the chills thinking about it. Really
Yeah.
a sweet experience. Um, there was some serious magic in the air that day.
Mm, yeah.
So yeah, that's a bittersweet story, but and not necessarily directed at grief, but just how appreciating, I mean, well, what a gift it is that these ceremonies can bring back our loved ones, that we can still, because so many of us don't really believe in ghosts or in spirits, and to
Mm,
get to see them and interact with them in a bodily way, not just in a speaking in our heads kind of way,
right.
which has its value, but to interact with them fully embodied, oh, that there's so much healing there. So much healing.
Well, I guess my next question is, so if someone's having a hard time maybe with grief, or they're not, maybe they feel like they're stuck in their grief, mourning the death of somebody, it sounds like this could potentially be a helpful option for them if they're stuck or
Yeah, either way. So they might be stuck because, right, they're maybe attached, like I was, more to the idea of the person than the actual person,
Mhm,
which is pretty egotistical. But that kind of depression
mhm,
is an inflation of
mhm,
ego. And also a person who's grieving in that way, sometimes the medicine gives them immense feelings of joy and lightness as like a compensatory function, and they realize suddenly they have this energy that I don't need to feel so bad. And it gives them the energy to carry on and not be stuck in their grief, to
yeah,
use your words.
yeah.
And some people are lucky enough to have those experiences, like the people I mentioned, where they get to see and interact with their loved ones.
So can you, okay, so I want to go back to what you said about when we're grieving the loss of something, a relationship, a person. You said that was egocentric, can be can be egocentric.
Yeah, if we're wallowing in something,
Mhm.
that mourning has its own natural process, and it's impossible for us as an outsider to judge that process.
Mhm.
But I can say that in my experience, similar to a depression, how a depression, when it lingers and really languishes, is a kind of ego inflation.
Mhm.
Like,
Okay.
why am I in this place? It's because I want to feel sorry for myself.
Mhm.
And that's not, I'm not saying that categorically about depression or people in it.
Right. Right. No, I know. I'm just the reason I'm asking is I'm thinking about a time in my life when I felt that way, really depressed over the end of a relationship, and I'm trying to remember what I was. I think I was in the mourning stage because I was mourning and mourning and mourning, and it was kind of like getting in the way of functioning for me. And somebody suggested I go to therapy, and going to therapy, that was the first time I went to therapy. And then the process for me was I realized like I was mourning, but I was also letting it define who I was going to be showing up in the world. And I didn't like that. So I was just trying to understand what you meant by ego defense. And I realized like I don't have to let this define me. I don't want this to be my persona. So I guess I'm understanding what you're saying. I was just trying to relate it to an experience of my own, and kind of just like how does that look on clients, or what does that look like for some people? As the therapist, how do you know when it's the grieving process and it's the mourning process, and then you get to a point where you're like, okay, this is more than, you know, it's your identity at this point, sort of thing. I was just kind of thinking that through.
Yeah, do you have any insights or clues on when you would say it starts to become their identity versus a natural process?
Mm, no, I think it's so individualized. I think that if you have the relationship with the client and you're working on it, it will present itself. The opportunity to understand what's really going on will present itself. It's just that's not one of those things like when somebody comes to me, I can't just go straight into that. Like,
Right, right,
oh, this
right.
is your ego talking.
Yeah,
It's like you have to have that relationship built. You have to have an understanding of what they've been through. You have to understand the relationship that they had with the person. What did that relationship do for them? I mean, there's a lot of variables that you got to know. But I think once you get to a point with your client and maybe you've built that relationship, it can be more like direct, like, hey, you know, this, and I'm just thinking about clients I've had where it's come to that point where it's like, I think this is beyond, mourning the relationship, because in other areas of your life, you're able to, it's not affecting you, but in this one area here, you're letting it define who you are. And and then that's okay. Well, let's just talk about it and figure out what is this about? Because that could be a whole other issue, right?
yeah,
So I mean, I'm not, for those listening, it's just kind of like I'm processing through like what could be going on, and there's always layers. Like you were saying, There's just always different layers that come up, and that's normal, and that makes sense. I'm not saying it's not normal. Just as a therapist and as a healer, you have to be attuned to, you have to use your skills, and you have to have good intuition,
Mm.
and you have to be genuine and kind, and I say kind as in having empathy and wanting to best help and support, not be right. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people out there
Mhm.
who want to be right, and they'd rather be right than helpful. And I see that sometimes in the therapy world, and that concerns me. But that's a whole other podcast, Pedro.
And so being right might mean in this case, like forcing their own understanding of the situation on the client or on the
Yeah,
patient.
or their own values, because that's what they're there for. You see that a lot right now. There's some therapists out there who seem more interested in telling their clients what they should or shouldn't do or feel or believe versus meeting the client where they're at and understanding the life experiences of that person. And that worries me. Um, I see that. I hear about it too from people, these days. But that's a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah.
I
And
don't.
I'll say that's the beauty of the medicine work is the plants they meet the people where they are. There's no
Right.
spiritual beliefs or understandings that get put on to them. This
Mm-hmm.
in an ideal, and if you're working with a good medicine person, a good shaman, then
Not
there's
even an
nothing.
issue.
No.
Not even an issue. Yeah. And I think I think some blah, 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 can't get it out. I think some therapists have lost sight of that in the work that they do. They feel like it's more of a cause or a activism than it is, you know, helping people find out what the root is and what the issues really are, and helping them, meeting them where they are versus where the therapist wants to promote their agenda. But plant medicine doesn't allow for that. And I would say neither does hypnotherapy. So I
Mm.
feel like, this is a good conversation. Is there anything else that you would like, our listeners to know today about plant medicine or grief? Anything?
I think we've had a thorough exploration of the topic, Lisa, and even and on top of that, other things as well. So it's been a
Yeah.
wonderful talk.
Yes, I always enjoy having you on the show and seeing you and connecting with you. So, don't be surprised if Pedro shows up again in the next, couple weeks on a different topic. So, if you guys, and in fact, if you're listening and you want to know more about plant medicine and have a specific topic that you want to learn more about in regards to plant medicine, send me an email, head over to my website and fill out the contact form, or find me on Instagram, Lisa Mustard Podcaster, and ask away. And I will pass the question over to Pedro, and we'll bring him back to answer some questions for people. So
Yeah,
thanks
we
again for
can.
being here. This has been
Sure,
great.
we can talk about relationships on Valentine's
Mm,
Day and plant medicine, right?
yeah. Yeah, we should do that. Maybe not on Valentine's Day, but in the future, we will have
Yeah,
you
yeah.
back. I love that. That's a really good topic. We should do relationships. I think that's a good one as well. So we'll put that on the books. We'll get that going.
Sounds great, Lisa. Thank you so much again for sitting with me and exploring some of these ideas about grief. In the process of this, I learn a lot too. It's wonderful.
Oh, awesome. Well, I love that. I learned too. So thanks for being here. Please note that the therapy show with Lisa Mustard is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and not a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice. Always consult with your therapist, doctor, or physician before implementing any suggestions from the show. The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard is edited and engineered by Chelsea Weaver. If you're looking to start a podcast or ready to take the editing off of your plate, be sure to visit chelseaweaverpodcasting.com. Well, that wraps up another episode of The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard. I know there are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, and I'm thankful you've chosen to listen to mine.
Be sure to visit lisamustard.com to access the show notes and discover more fantastic content.
And I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the show. Thank you.